notice how usually you think of the kicking the ball around as the one goal, and of course that didn't occur until like the last minute, and that was a startling idea. So that's the Monty Python. How many folks have seen that one before? Couple folks. So, good morning, welcome. The goal today is to actually begin doing some of the philosophy that we're looking at. The reading assignment was to read the Apology. I hope everybody had a chance. How many did have a chance perhaps to also read the Euthyphro? Kind of an interesting, a lot of texts start off with the Euthyphro to lead you into the Apology first, because the Euthyphro kind of explains why so many people in Athens thought Socrates was an asshole, basically. I suppose he actually was, really, the way things work out. Did you have a chance to see the Bettany Hughes video that I posted as a possibility? I know that's kind of extra and just fun. I never know how much time you guys have to do stuff. Back in the day, that was like life. We just read philosophy, talked philosophy, went to philosophy classes, read philosophy, and repeat. And we weren't interrupted by things like TV, the internet, games. It didn't have any of that stuff, But you guys have 3 kids that you're raising by yourself, and you're working 2 or 3 full-time jobs, plus you're going to school full-time, etc. Right? I guess? No. I've actually met a few students that were just about in that situation, which it's impossible. How on earth can you concentrate and read and think about stuff when you're that busy? So life has changed for a lot of people, and I understand that. However, looking at Socrates, I think what we do have to do is put him into context, and the Greek context is the one I mean. So if we go to where philosophy began, it began in Greece. We looked at some of this. What is philosophy? Following the tradition. Well, the tradition goes back at least to this. I think there's lots of good reasons for wanting to push the tradition farther back, especially when we get to things like the Timaeus, Plato's Timaeus. And we talk about Socrates, but we also talk about Plato. It might be confusing. You have to realize that Plato was a student of Socrates. Plato was the one who wrote everything. So when we're talking about Plato and his writings and his dialogues, Plato's the author, but Socrates is the main character throughout the entire dialogues. I think there might be 1 or 2 where he's not a main conversant. But for the most part, all the dialogues are going to include Socrates, whose name, as I look up Socrates, I think it means something like all the power, as if he's the one that wins all the arguments, even when he obviously loses. Like in the Apology, he ends up being condemned to death, despite our view that in reading the Apology according to Plato, there is another one out there, and they're remarkably similar. So there's at least 2 versions of this text that people can look at and say, well, yeah, it seems like this was pretty much close to what had happened in the Apology. And by the way, you can visit Socrates' cell, Athens. Did I spell any of that right? Looks like there it is. So it's a tourist place. You could go visit it in Greece today. Still there. It's kind of fun. So this seems like a clearly historical event, pretty famous. Interesting thing, remember the one question I have in the test, number 6, if you choose to select it, is to compare Jesus and Socrates, which might seem odd, but if you look at Ben Franklin, anybody know who Ben Franklin was? Yes? His 13th rule is be humble. And when we look at the 13th one, funny how last night when I looked this up, it was really quick. It came right up to the top. 13 necessary virtues. Number 13 is humility. And notice he says, imitate. Hey, come back. Imitate Jesus and Socrates. Kind of an odd. So this is an old tradition to compare Jesus and Socrates. Might even ask, where did Jesus get his ideas?
I mean, he claims to get him from his father, God.
Yes. But we also know historically he was a follower of John. Yes? Where did John get his ideas? We don't know, right? But it's interesting in a contemporary sense. A lot of folks analyze John and think that he's a cynic. He matches the typical cynic philosopher from Greece. And an example of that, by the way, is Diogenes. So we can look at Diogenes. We'll talk about him a little bit as we go. Notice he's a contemporary of Alexander, and that puts him back with Aristotle. Yes.
Is that the chicken guy? Or is that a different philosopher?
It's the chicken guy.
It is. How's the chicken thing go?
It was something like, I think it was Aristotle was like preaching to like a group of people about like how humans were.
And someone threw the chicken over the wall, a plucked chicken, and it was a
It's believed
featherless
to be
biped.
Diogenes.
Yeah. It's probably a joke, actually. I don't know how well a plucked chicken would do, actually. Anybody ever plucked a live chicken? It's really awful, wouldn't it?
Not live ones, but they would freeze very fast.
One of my favorite videos is Sarah Palin when she pardoned a turkey for Thanksgiving. Do you remember? Yes. And she did. I don't know if she paid attention or not, but behind her was a gentleman who was decapitating turkeys while the camera was running. So if you're curious about that. But Diogenes is interpreted by some as a follower of Socrates. So if we think about this kind of chain, one argument is to say that Jesus was a cynic philosopher following Socrates. So there's an interesting approach to that, apart from, of course, the traditional view. One person who argues that is Robert Funk, and he does that in his book Honest to Jesus, which is where I got that idea. So that's just there for your interest. But when we go back and we look at the so-called beginnings of philosophy, which is a Greek word meaning love of wisdom, as we already discussed, the first official philosopher, Thales of Miletus, And I think Thales basically means water, which is kind of interesting. Notice an awful lot of the names that we look at basically name what the person was famous for. Plato is odd because Plato is a nickname. We know it's a nickname. Supposedly his given name was Aristocles. Aristoi means best, and cles means the glory of the best. So remember, Cles was no honor, right? So Cles, no honor. He's dissed by Agamemnon, right? When we think of the other ones, you can look them up. And Heraclitus is pretty easy. Hera is where we get the word hours from. So Hera is Zeus's wife, and assuming she is the goddess of time. So that makes sense. And Heraclitus is another version of glory or honor to time. So he's honoring time. And it's interesting, his philosopher is that everything flows, that there is no stationary moment, everything is constantly flowing, his arche. And this is the concept that they're all looking for. The arche is the basic building block of everything, which today, if we think about it, we have the standard the quarks and the muons and nuons and preons and all the ions and all that's the standard system that we have. But they're of course starting this, and Thales is famous for thinking that the arche, the basic building block of everything, was water. Anaximenes, basically a generation after Thales, and from the same area of Miletus, which is really in Turkey now. So it was a Greek colony in the area of Turkey. Came up with the idea that air is thinner than water, and so it seems like air ought to be the basic arche that makes water. And you could go through why you see in nature these are all necessary. Heraclitus, Anaximander came up with the idea of the infinite, and the Greeks didn't really like that. The infinite hurt their head almost as much as it hurts our heads, and so they didn't like that one very much. Heraclitus used fire as his metaphor for change. Everything is in constant change. There's no stepping into the same river twice. Probably you've heard that expression, because everything's flowing. There's no way that you can stop time and then take a look at it, and so on. And fire is his arche. Anaxagoras came up with the idea of mind, which is nous in German. Nous in Greek. And the idea of atoms. Atom, A means not, and tom means cuttable. So atom means not cuttable. You can't get smaller than that. That was the basic meaning of the word. And yet, of course, we've figured out ways of cutting atoms up. So when that happened, they really should have said, oh, that's not the right name for it, but they didn't. So that's kind of one indication of what happens to words. We still say that the sun rises in the east, even though most folks like to think. In fact, this is my quiz question today. I'll step aside for a moment and ask you this. Does the earth go around the sun, or does the sun go around the earth? It's right. It's rising right now. You can see it coming up. So does the sun come around the earth, or does the earth go around the sun? That's my quiz question. You're welcome to take sides on that. By the way, I thought of your question, the straw. Yes? I mean, I puzzled that all weekend, just so you know. I thought, well, the problem he asked the question as we were leaving on Wednesday, how many holes, or how many holes does a straw have? One or two? And of course, the issue is you've got multiple contexts when you're thinking about that kind of question. On the one sense, you might think of the whole straw as one big long hole, in which case you might answer one. On the other hand, you might be thinking there's one on each side, starts, the tube. In that case, there's two. My first thought was, in a microscopic level, it's full of holes from one end to the other. It's just the holes have been engineered so that they're smaller than the oxygen or the fluid that you're expected to use them. So the problem is thinking that there's one correct answer and all the other ones are wrong.
Mathematically, there is one answer.
I like
Not
to
logically,
ask,
but
I
Well,
haven't
that's
gotten
the
to
context,
same
though.
answers.
in that context.
In that context. So as long as you keep your mind on the idea that there are multiple contexts that will change which answer is the correct answer.
I don't think I've gotten two same answers.
Well, that could be an indication of the richness of your environment, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But atoms, uncuttable, kind of interesting. That definitely comes back to us. Pythagoras, very interesting, because his concern was number. By the way, Pythagoras means speaking out in the marketplace. Agora is a marketplace, and Pyth is speaking. And you get the idea that he's got no secrets from the crowd, and yet that's totally the opposite of what we hear, because he was supposed to have had a secret society where they knew all the secrets that they talked about. Plato is considered to have been a follower of Pythagoras, a Pythagorean. So Parmenides, very interesting. He gives us the concept of the one.